Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second annual International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, something to keep in mind is that GCRR is not interested in converting or deconverting anybody from any particular belief system. We are strictly an academic institution, and we seek to approach the discussion of God and suffering purely from a scholastic standpoint, whether that standpoint is theistic, atheistic, or something else entirely. Now, that's actually, in fact, one of the greatest things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world with a whole bunch of different backgrounds and traditions, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Also, as a special gift to everybody, all you have to do is go to gcrr.org, our website, and look up our newest publication called God and Horrendous Suffering. And with that, all you have to do is scroll down to the bottom, and you can download a special sneak preview of the book by clicking the preview button. And if you end up wanting to purchase that book, we do recommend that you go through the GCRR website because our prices are a lot lower. But also, we're going to give you 15% off more than on the retail price. All you have to do is use the promo code SUFFERING, and that's all in lowercase. Use the promo code SUFFERING at checkout. And with that said, I'd like to introduce you to my very good friend and our next presenter, Dr. David Eller, and allow me to share my screen to give a proper introduction. So Dr. Eller today is going to discuss The Truth Hurts, an anthropological perspective on religion and suffering. Now, Dr. Eller is a cultural anthropologist who specializes in religion and ethics and religious violence. He's the author of several books on the overlapping subjects, including From Culture to Ethnicity to Conflict, to Violence and Culture, a cross-cultural and interdisciplinary perspective, Introducing Anthropology of Religion, Cruel Creeds, Virtuous Violence, and one of his newest books that came out through GCRR Press is Trump and Political Theology. He also has two more books that are about ready to come out or have already just recently come out, updated edition of his anthropology texts and a new anthropology on Donald Trump that you should check out. He's also published two books on atheism, one called Natural Atheism and then Atheism Advanced. So definitely check those out. He is a retired associate professor of anthropology, and he is currently the head of our very own global anthropology department here at the Global Center for Religious Research. So, Dr. Eller, thank you so much for being here. I'll turn it over to you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Darren, and all of my colleagues and friends who are joining us here today. I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to share that with you now. Give me a second. Oh, actually, notes. This is the problem that we had a little earlier, Darren. I gotta obviously get the proper version up.
Yeah, and if you want to stop sharing your screen and then re-click it, since it came up on a different screen last time.
Yeah, I just remember how we had to do that. So I think there's that it?
No, go ahead. Oh, there, okay. Now it's there.
Okay, very good. Okay, so I'd like to propose an anthropological look at religion and suffering today. And this is how my work obviously has been progressing for the last few years. And I'll be talking about, social kinds of suffering, not natural suffering, but we'll see that as we progress. So the first thing that I want to suggest is that both sides on the atheism-theism debate have tended to offer suffering, especially extreme and unjust suffering, as one of the best, if not the best argument against God. And I actually don't share that position. I consider the argument from violence or from injustice or from suffering to be a kind of uninteresting argument, or at least certainly not a persuasive or definitive one, for two main reasons. First of all, because obviously religions have been working for centuries or millennia to counter that argument. suggesting all kinds of theodicies from, human free will to an evil agent like Satan, to God testing. There are lots and lots of ways to meet that objection. Obviously, the fact that the argument of suffering exists and people continue to believe in God shows that it's not a knockdown argument. And then second, of course, this particular argument only works against certain kinds of gods. And that's the kind of God that we talk about mostly, God with the capital G, that is the name of the Judeo-Christian, the Abrahamic God. But as we'll talk about in anthropology, we can't stop there. And so I think this is the only time in the presentation, and hopefully in any of my work, that you'll see God with a capital G. When I want to refer to the Judeo-Christian God, I will say the Judeo-Christian God. If I mean some other God, the Greek gods or Zeus, I'll mention them by name. But God is a generic term with a small g. And there are lots of kind of gods in the world, and most of them, quite honestly, don't have the characteristics of the Abrahamic God, of Yahweh, Jehovah. Most of them aren't expected to be all good and all powerful, and therefore really the problem of justice and suffering goes away. It becomes an unimportant argument in addressing those kinds of gods. So my field of anthropology takes a wider view on both of these issues. To understand religious violence, we need to understand both religion and violence separately. And I talk about that a lot in my Cruel Creeds book. I won't do an entire study of that here today. I just wanted to kind of indicate for those of you who aren't anthropologists and maybe don't know much about the field, to kind of explain what we're about in my field. Obviously, we look at a cross-cultural perspective. That is, we're looking at all the different kinds of religions, not just theism. And all the different theisms, not just Judeo-Christian theism. There are many, many different kinds of religions and different kinds of theisms out there. And in fact, sometimes I say that if I wanted to convey the nature of anthropology in one sentence, it would be make every singular a plural. That is, there's no such thing as God, there's gods. No such thing as religion, religions. Theism, theisms. Christianity, Christianities, et cetera, et cetera. I think related to or following from that perspective is our holism. That is, we look at every part of culture in relation to and affected by every other part. So we can't understand the religion of a particular society without looking at its economics and its politics and its language, its gender roles, pretty much every other aspect of the culture. The religion will be shaped by those other parts, and it will also shape those other parts. And finally, and I think that this is a consequence of both of these, our perspective of relativism. That is, we cannot use one religion, in this case, to understand other religions. We cannot use one religion's language to understand other religions and their language. So that religion-specific terms like, as I mentioned during Dr. Kramer's presentation, worship, or sin, or hell, or reincarnation, et cetera, don't apply necessarily to other religions. And that would work just as well if we were trying to use, say, Buddhist language, nirvana and samsara to understand Christianity. Or if we were trying to use Australian Aboriginal terms. I did my fieldwork with a group called the Walbury, and we couldn't use terms like Jukurpa and Pilirpa to understand Christianity. It simply doesn't apply. So we have to understand each religion, each culture in its own terms, and of course not judge one as better or absolute than any other. Okay, so obviously the first point I wanted to make is that concepts of gods differ across cultures if they have the concept at all. God is not, with a small g, a universal religious concept. And even when it does occur in a culture, it may well occur in combination with other concepts. So here's a little flow chart of religions, and I assume you can see my pointer too. If not, I'm talking about the right-hand side of the chart. Obviously, atheism deals mostly, with theisms, And most of our discussions in academia are talking about, monotheism in particular. In fact, if I had a more extensive chart, I could put, Christianity down here, and then Catholic or Protestant below that, and then all the various denominations of Protestant below that. So it goes far beyond this. But there are many, many other kinds of religion that either don't have gods at all or have gods and other things. Among them, terms that we use like animism, animatism. I'm going to actually refute this term, ancestor worship, and then what I call ethical non-theism, something like Theravada Buddhism, that isn't particularly concerned about gods. It's concerned about how we live our life and how we live the next life and how we get out of life with or without gods. So there are lots of different sources of supernatural causation of suffering in different religions. Gods are one in many religions, including Christianity, a la the problem of Job that we were hearing about last time. As far as I'm concerned, the theme of Job, the message of Job is God is not going to be just. God is not going to be good, but hang in there anyhow. Don't stop believing. Don't expect justice, because obviously if you did, you'd be sorely disappointed. Anyhow, one cause of suffering in many religions is the animistic spirits. That is the spirits that inhabit rocks and trees and animals and sometimes natural phenomena like the moon and the sun, the wind and the rain, sometimes kind of social phenomena like war, et cetera, et cetera. And while I have this little graphic up here, this is not quite correct. Animists don't necessarily believe that everything has a spirit. They might believe that some rocks do and some don't. In fact, a famous anthropologist, Irving Hallowell, once asked a Native American whether all rocks have spirits, and they said no, but some do. And of course, it's an important issue to know which one. Or in Aboriginal Australia, some trees are Jukurtpa, that's their word for dreaming spirit, and some of the exact same species aren't. So it becomes obviously very important to know which particular trees are spirits and which aren't, because you have to treat them differently. Ancestor spirits, not ancestor worship, because quite honestly, in many, if not most traditions, people do not worship the ancestors. They may sacrifice to them, or they may kind of hope they go away. They may try to placate them. They may try to, usher them off. Among the Kalahari Bushmen, they believe that the ancestors are the cause of most of human suffering, not because the ancestors hate us, obviously, but because the ancestors love us too much. And therefore, they want to pull us across to their side. They want to be with us. And so they cause sickness and death. And so the Kalahari, their Kung or San Bushmen, their attitude toward the dead ancestors is, we love you, please go away. Which is not worshipful at all. There's also what we call animistic forces, which are not persons, but more like energies. Probably the best examples of animistic forces that we know in our culture are qi in Chinese traditional religion and medicine, mana in Polynesian cultures. A number of other cultures have something that kind of equates to luck, which is sometimes non-personal, sometimes a little personal. The Apache had a concept called Diyi, D-I-Y-I, which did have some personal qualities. It liked working with some people and not with others, and it could get angry and leave you, just as animistic spirits might cause trouble because you disrespect them. Because they want certain kinds of behavior, rituals from you. Sometimes they don't really care about you. They're just pursuing their own business. And so they hurt you. Sometimes they're capricious. Sometimes they're downright mean. So all of those reasons could be explanations for human suffering. As well, of course, as other supernatural beings, everything from ogres and fairies to vampires and whatever else. The human world is just full of supernatural beings who are at best to be concerned about, and at worst really dangerous to us. Not to mention human practitioners like witches and sorcerers, who are in most traditions, and again, these are terms that have been borrowed from some religions and applied to others, but tend to be malicious. Sometimes witches do it even without trying, kind of this animosity spews out of them. Sorcery is often considered to be more of a technique where you have to use, words or objects in order to cause harm, but both are considered harmful in many cultures. Interestingly, for example, I think it was the Menominee Native Americans believe that all elders are witches because they have such great social power. And therefore, elders were always to be feared, even when they were alive. And ancestors might well be witches too. And again, there is a graphic to point out that sometimes witches are the source of suffering, and sometimes they are the targets of suffering. Obviously, if you believe in witchcraft and you believe that witches are evil, then persecuting witches, even killing witches, becomes a perfectly justified thing to do. Now, talking about theistic religions specifically, gods are not even always good, and they're not always all that powerful. In some religions, gods have specific powers, especially in polytheisms. Sometimes they have limited goodness. Sometimes they're indifferent, quite honestly. For example, the Azandi, an East African people, talk about their god Mbori or Mboli as someone who's really not interested in humans and does not intervene in human affairs. At best, he's a distant figure, maybe a creator, although among the Ulithi Islanders in the Pacific, God's not even a creator. They have lots of gods, but the world is just here. So gods are not always the creators, they're not always omnipotent, not always all good. One of the best cases of that is the Semai, a group in Malaysia, who are sometimes regarded as the most peaceful and nonviolent people in the world. And what they are actually is scared silly. They're scared of humans because they've been the subject of persecution, slave trade, extermination for many years. And they're also afraid of their God, who, as you can see, is considered by them to be a stupid, incontinent, vicious dupe, a ludicrous monster who they far from worship. Instead, they fear him on a good day, and they also make fun of him. In fact, they rather pride themselves in tricking their God when they can, because he's not all that smart. But mostly he just terrorizes them. And so they live in kind of a constant state of fear. All kinds of trickster gods and less than gods, Loki, Hermes, Prometheus to an extent. Lots of gods who enjoy tricking the gods, who enjoy tricking humans, who enjoy lying, stealing, really, really bad characters. And they're really important. And I talk about this idea in my political theology book in the last chapter on Trump. I think we're seeing a lot of tricksterish behavior these days of people who are intentionally breaking rules, blaspheming and sacrileging, and obviously lying and stealing in order to, create the world that they want. So I think that we have to obviously consider those kinds of beings. And sometimes, again, they are gods, or at least the children of gods. And then again, specific wars of gods. If there's a god of war, a god of disease, a god of suffering of whatever kind, then clearly those gods are not intended to be good. Their job description, their portfolio is suffering and harm. And that's really quite a common theme across religions. The gods that aren't very nice. They do everything from rape to lie to cheat. And Zeus is, of course, one of the most famous ones. No one ever expected Zeus to be morally upright, and it wasn't a problem. And we might say, well, but a monotheistic God has to be all good. Not necessarily. That's what we're most accustomed to. But a monotheistic God may well be complex and diverse, even contradictory, be both good and bad. That would sound strange to us, but again, the way that we think about gods and goodness isn't the way that all cultures do, or the way that it has to be thought about. So, religious violence too is very diverse, and again, I'm talking about violence, the violence that humans perpetrate. I'm not talking about natural suffering or natural evil in this particular discussion. partly because anthropology doesn't tend to look at that as much. We look obviously at the social, and partly because anthropology does emphasize that it's hard to draw a firm line between the natural and the social. Much quote unquote natural violence or natural evil does have a social component. I think, for example, of floods. Many floods are partially or indirectly caused by human intervention in river systems. And therefore, it's not entirely a natural evil. Obviously, hurricanes and tornadoes these days are partly, at least indirectly, an effect of global warming, which has social origins. So we can't necessarily keep natural and social apart. At any rate, I want to talk briefly, and I've written more extensively about 6 particular kinds of religious violence which cause suffering. And I organize them roughly into 2 categories with the understanding that nature abhors categories and that any particular case of violence may well straddle these. And even the concept of victim or enemy may be not quite as non-porous as we think they are. But at any rate, for organizational sake, I would put sacrifice, self-directed harm, and crime and abuse, including things like murder, sexual abuse on the side of violence against victims, and then persecution, ethno-religious conflict, and war, holy war and religious-inspired terrorism under the category of violence against an enemy. And I'll talk about that distinction here in a second. Okay, let's start with sacrifice, which probably of the non-holy war categories has received the most attention in academia. I don't even want to call it a definition exactly, but what we're talking about is roughly destruction of some sort, usually, or at least in the classical model, by killing for a religious purpose. In fact, I've been thinking about this, and I don't think that there's another kind of sacrifice other than metaphorical than a religious sacrifice. We might sacrifice, lunches to take up and buy a car or something, but that's not sacrifice in the strict sense of the term. As I'm going to say in a few minutes, not all sacrifice involves killing, and not all sacrifice involves living beings at all, which actually does complicate or refute some of the dominant theories of sacrifice. But again, we'll get to that in a second. So, some of the various explanations for sacrifice that people have offered since Huber and Moos, followers and kinsmen of Durkheim, including obviously scapegoating, somehow the projection of violence from one object to another, and probably the most stereotypical example is the Akedah, the sacrifice or the near sacrifice by Abraham of Isaac. But again, we can't use that necessarily as a model for all sacrifice. And in fact, I'm going to show in a second that it's really not a good model. It's one kind, but not prototypical in any way whatsoever. Many religions or many explanations have turned more on atonement, getting right with the spirits in some way, or expiation, working off sin or negative energy or bad karma or whatever. And exactly how that's supposed to work is never specified. Propitiation, again, making the gods or the spirits happy in some way. Maybe they like the smell of burnt flesh. Maybe they're hungry. But in some way, this is going to, earn their goodwill. And in a world with spirits, their goodwill is important. Giving gifts to the spirits. That idea doesn't make perfect sense in Christianity, because what would an omnipotent, self-sufficient God need? But in many religions, the spirits do need things, including the dead ancestors. They need things. So if we get, again, outside of the Christian mindset, that this makes some sense. Simply a communal meal. Sometimes it's not food, quite honestly, and sometimes it's not eaten, and sometimes it's destroyed or burnt beyond the point of consumption. So that's not always the point. And even if it was, that wouldn't be particularly special, because we can have a communal meal without sacrifice. Some of you may know that the leading theory, probably since the 1970s, has been René Girard's mimetic theory, presented in his book, Violence and the Sacred, think it was 74 or so. His argument is that there is an inherent relationship between religion and violence, but not the one we usually think. That is, it's not religion that causes violence, but violence that causes religion. And here's how it works. Once upon a time, humans didn't have religion, but they were living in social groups. And because of the nature of culture, this is his mimesis, we all learn to want the same things, to value the same things, which puts us in competition with each other, which naturally breeds hostility. So culture, he said, simply breeds hostility, competition and hostility. There are two ways that can go. We can either fight each other and basically destroy society, or we can find some other victim, dump all of this anger on that victim, destroy the victim, and then purge our anger temporarily, because the anger will come back. Sacrifice is not a good solution. It's not a permanent solution, but it's a temporary solution. So his argument is that religion, which equals sacrifice for him, religion is sacrifice. Sacrifice is religion, which equals substitutive violence. That is, hurting not the person you really want to hurt, but somebody else, solves the problem of culture, solves the problem of violence, makes culture possible. And therefore, he makes two specific predictions: that sacrifice should exist in the very most primitive cultures, the ones who are the closest to the beginning of culture, and that it should disappear when cultures develop political institutions, prisons and police and things like that, so that we can punish people in some other way. We don't have to necessarily get a victim and destroy the victim. It so happens that both of these predictions are refuted thoroughly by the ethnographic evidence, which is a strong suggestion that this theory is totally wrong. And in fact, I intend to write about this and explore this in more detail in the future. But all of my research indicates that the mimetic theory of religion and violence is totally wrong. If we look at other occasions, actual occasions for sacrifice, and there you see a famous Mayan or Aztec, heart sacrifice to the sun, I think we get a little closer to understanding not only what sacrifice is really about, but something that actually is kind of at the root of religion. So in many cultures, they do sacrifice an animal, a human, a cucumber, liquid, various things, in order to prevent or eliminate sin, or in more generic terms, pollution, to get off the bad stuff. Again, how that exactly is supposed to work is never specified, beyond thinking about something like, washing in the blood of the lamb. If we think of it as literally a solvent, I guess that's something. But why would that remove pollution? Feeding the spirits, obviously, on the premise, again, that sometimes the gods get hungry or they get weak and they need food like the rest of us. Now we're starting to get to something a little more important. Girard predicted that complex, centralized societies shouldn't have sacrifice, and that's where we see it the most. We see it in the Aztec and the Mayan societies. We see it in the African Dahomey kingdom. We see it in the pre-contact Hawaiian kingdom. That's where the kings are often the main sacrificers, and sacrifice occurs at their coronation, at their death, often in what's called retainer sacrifice. Great numbers of people are killed to accompany the king into the next world, especially, say, in ancient Egypt. As part of royal ritual, sometimes one or more humans would be killed, or simply as a display of their power, their absolute power over life and death. Rites of passage, especially male initiation rituals, are often accompanied by sacrifice. Often planting fields, building walls, building houses or other constructions is also a time for sacrifice, as well as sometimes entering treaties, making agreements, starting a new business. All these kinds of things might be moments of sacrifice, which don't seem to have anything to do with anger in particular, nor do they have anything to do with killing necessarily. What do they have to do with? It seems that being a king, becoming an adult male, planting a field, making a strong wall, making a strong treaty or agreement are all about energy. They're all about...
One last thing you might want to know is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. But we have a big problem. See, in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is recognized as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma is still in its infancy. This means that there are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we have seen and experienced, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem. As it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical. And GCRR wants to correct this gap of knowledge, and we're hoping to get your help with that. So we have set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first, most comprehensive sociological study on the existence, causes, and manifestations of religious trauma. Now, the reason we are crowdsourcing this stuff is because we were actually set to get a grant, federal grant for this research project, and then the federal government halted all funding for mental health research. So we were left holding the bag. That's why we're hoping the public can join us in this effort. All you have to do is go to GoFundMe.com and search for the phrase religious trauma sociological study, or you can click the link that I'm going to put in the chat box. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms just to get the word out about this really important research project.